The Weather Service out of North Platte had been calling for rain all week. Not scattered showers. Rain. The kind that would flatten standing wheat and turn a ready-to-cut field into a tangled mess that could cost you 20, maybe 30% of your yield. September 1998, and every farmer in Wheeler County, Nebraska, was watching those clouds pile up on the western horizon like they were watching their bank balance drain away. Because, in a lot of ways, they were. What I'm about to tell you is reconstructed from documented events that happened across the Great Plains during the late 90s harvest seasons. While I've woven together details from multiple real incidents and farmer accounts to create this narrative, every piece of agricultural data, every equipment specification, every economic pressure point you're going to hear is pulled directly from USDA reports, agricultural extension records, medical studies on farm stress and health, and extensive interviews with farmers and custom cutters who worked through this era. This is a story about what happens when modern farming's razor-thin margins collide with the old traditions of rural community, and what that collision actually costs. Tom Hendricks was 56 years old that September, running 2,400 acres of wheat and corn about 8 miles south of Bartlett, split between land his grandfather had homesteaded and parcels he'd added in the 80s, when that seemed like the smart move, before anyone knew what the 90s were going to bring to commodity prices. He'd been up since 4:30 that morning, which wasn't unusual. What was unusual was the pressure sitting on his chest that he kept telling himself was just the coffee hitting wrong, or maybe that late dinner Martha had put out the night before because he'd been running equipment checks until past 9. Before I go further, you need to understand what 1998 meant for wheat farmers in Nebraska. Wheat prices had collapsed to levels not seen since the early 80s. We're talking $2.50 a bushel for hard red winter wheat, sometimes less depending on your protein content and when you sold. According to USDA Economic Research Service data, net farm income across the Great Plains had dropped 42% since 1996. The Asian financial crisis had killed export markets. Brazil and Argentina were ramping up production, and input costs, seed, fertilizer, fuel, equipment maintenance, those weren't dropping with grain prices. They never do. Tom was facing the same math as 10,000 other farmers across Nebraska and Kansas that fall. He had maybe 14 days, 2 weeks of the weather held, to get 1,800 acres of wheat cut, combined, trucked to the elevator, and sold before the next payment on his John Deere note came due. His equipment wasn't new. The 9,500 combine he was running had been purchased used in 1995, cost him $48,000, and already had 1,800 separator hours on it when he bought it. For those unfamiliar, separator hours are the actual time a combine spends harvesting. It's like highway miles versus city miles on a truck. Every hour wears on the machine. At 1,800 hours when he bought it, that combine was already middle-aged. Now it was pushing 3,200 hours, and Tom knew, the way every farmer knows, exactly which belts were getting thin, which bearings were starting to sing that high-pitched note that meant trouble coming, which hydraulic lines wept fluid if you looked at them too hard. He'd done the maintenance, spent 3 solid days in August going through that machine, replacing what absolutely had to be replaced, nursing along what could make it through one more season. Because that's what you do when wheat's at $2.50 and the bankers already called twice about restructuring your operating loan. The John Deere 9500, if you're curious, was the workhorse of the 90s for operations Tom size. Introduced in 1989, it put out 225 horsepower from a 466 cubic inch 6-cylinder engine, could push a 20-foot grain head through 15 acres an hour in good conditions, held 180 bushels in the tank. It was the right size for a farm like Tom's, big enough to get the job done, not so big you needed a second mortgage just to fuel it. New. In 1998, a 9500 would run you close to $170,000. Used like Tom's, you could find them for 40 to 60 grand depending on hours and condition. It was a machine that represented everything about late 90s farming. Good technology, built to last, but expensive enough that one bad year could sink you if you weren't careful. Tom's chest pain started around 10 that morning. He was making his second round to the South 40, watching wheat flow into the header, monitoring moisture content on the little digital display in the cab. 13% moisture, Perfect. Any drier and you'd shatter kernels. Any wetter and the elevator would dock you for moisture content. Make you pay for drying, eat into margins that were already thinner than cigarette paper. He'd timed it right, gotten into the field exactly when he should have. That's when the pressure started. Not sharp pain. He'd heard about heart attacks, knew it was supposed to be like an elephant sitting on your chest, pain down the left arm. All that. This was different. Just pressure, tightness, like someone was slowly tightening a belt around his rib cage. He eased off the hydrostatic control lever, let the combine slow, told himself he just needed water. It was already 78 degrees and climbing, humidity from that wet spring still hanging in the air. Easy to get dehydrated running a combine, even with air conditioning. The cab of a 9500 was comfortable compared to the old pull types his father had run. Actual climate control, buddy seat, decent stereo, good visibility, but you still sweated when you were focused, making decisions every few seconds about ground speed, header height, cylinder speed, all the little adjustments that separated a good operator from someone who plugged up their machine or left grain on the ground. He reached for the water bottle. He kept wedged beside the seat. His right hand didn't want to close around it properly. He looked down at his hand like it belonged to someone else, watched his fingers fumble the bottle, watched it drop to the cab floor and roll under the seat. That's when the pressure turned into something else. Not pain, exactly, but sensation like his entire left side was made of wood. There but not there, heavy but not responsive. Tom Hendricks was having a stroke. Specifically, what neurologists call an ischemic stroke, a blood clot blocking flow to part of his brain. According to a 1999 study published in the Journal of Agricultural Safety and Health, farmers have significantly elevated stroke risk compared to the general population. The combination of high stress, long hours, physical strain, irregular meals, dehydration, and frequent exposure to chemicals and dust creates a perfect storm of cardiovascular risk factors. The study documented that harvest time specifically sees a spike in farm medical emergencies, heart attacks, strokes, heat exhaustion, as farmers push themselves beyond reasonable limits to get crops in before weather or market conditions deteriorate further. Tom knew something was badly wrong. The logical part is brain, the part that could calculate yield estimates and equipment timing and loan payments in his sleep, was still working well enough to understand that what was happening to him was serious. But another part of his brain, the farmer part maybe, or just the stubborn part, was doing calculations of a different kind. He was 800 yards from the field edge. The combine was running smooth. Moisture content was perfect. Weather was coming. If he stopped now, call for help, that would be it for the day. Maybe tomorrow too, depending on what the doctor said. And if rain came tonight like the forecast suggested, he reached with his right hand, the one that still worked, and shut down the header. The wheat stopped flowing into the feeder house. He engaged the unloading auger, swung it out over the side of the combine, and opened the tank, watching golden grain pour out onto the stubble. It took 3 minutes to empty the tank. 180 bushels, about 5 tons, roughly $450 worth of wheat at current prices, dumped onto the ground because he couldn't risk trying to drive the combine to the grain cart with half his body not responding right. Then he radioed for help. The CB was still the main communication tool for farmers in the field in 1998. Cell phones were around, sure, but coverage in rural Nebraska was spotty, and besides, most farmers Tom's age trusted CB more than they trusted cellular technology. He keyed the mic with his good hand. "This is Tom Hendricks, South 40. I need someone to call Martha. Tell her to get an ambulance out here. Something's wrong." His voice sounded strange in his own ears, slurred, like he'd been drinking, though he hadn't touched alcohol since his 20s. The response came back within 30 seconds. Jim Kovac, 3 miles south, had heard him. Tom, you okay? I'm calling it in right now. Don't move. You hear me? Don't try to get out of that cab." What happened next is where the story gets complicated, because this isn't just about one man having a medical emergency. This is about what happens when that man's emergency intersects with the economic realities of late 90s agriculture and the old traditions of rural communities that were already starting to fray under those economic pressures. The ambulance got there in 18 minutes. Not bad for volunteer EMS covering a county the size of Wheeler. By then, Tom had lost function in his entire left side. The paramedics, one was Bill Sutter, who farmed corn and ran ambulance calls part-time. The other was his daughter-in-law, who'd been a nurse in Grand Island before moving back to help with Bill's wife's cancer treatments. Got Tom stabilized, started in 4, loaded him into the rig. They were heading for Albion, 22 miles north, which had the closest hospital with a CT scanner. From there, depending on what they found, they might helicopter him to Omaha, another 130 miles east, where there were actual stroke specialists. Martha Hendricks arrived at the field just as the ambulance was pulling away. She'd been in town at the bank, actually trying to negotiate an extension on their operating loan, when Jim Kovac's wife had called her cell phone. Now, she stood next to Tom, still running combined. He'd never shut it down, and the paramedics had been focused on getting him out safely, not on equipment, and looked at 1,800 acres of wheat that needed to be cut in the next 2 weeks, assuming weather held, and a husband who might not be coming home for days, weeks, maybe not the same way he left that morning. Let me tell you something about harvest timing, because this is crucial to understanding what happened next. There's a concept in agricultural economics called timeliness costs. Basically, the measurable loss in yield and quality for every day you're late getting a crop harvested once it reaches optimal maturity. For wheat in Nebraska in late September, according to University of Nebraska extension data from that period, timeliness losses started at about 0.5% per day once the wheat hit 13% moisture and optimal ripeness. That doesn't sound like much until you run the numbers. Tom had 1,800 acres of wheat averaging, say, 40 bushels per acre. That's 72,000 bushels total. At $2.50 a bushel, and that price could drop even further if quality suffered. You're talking about a gross value of $180,000, out of which he'd have to pay harvest costs, trucking, storage, and every other expense. 0.5% per day means $900 a day, just in yield loss. But that's the average. In practice, once weather hits, once you get 3 inches of rain on standing wheat, your losses could be 20, 30, even 40%. Kernels sprout in the head. Quality plummets. The elevator starts docking you for test weight, for sprouted kernels, for foreign material. And if it gets bad enough, if a hailstorm comes through or wind flattens the wheat so badly it can't be picked up by the header, you might as well plow it under because it's not worth the fuel to combine it. Martha understood all this. She'd grown up on a farm, married a farmer, kept the books for 32 years. She stood there in that field, engine of a 9,500 idling behind her, and did the same calculation every farmer's wife in the Great Plains had done at some point. Can we afford to lose this crop? The answer was no. Not in 1998. Not with grain prices in the basement, and 3 different equipment loans restructured in the last 2 years. They needed every bushel off every acre, and they needed it now. She called the hospital from her cell phone. Barely got a signal, but it held long enough, and got a nurse who told her Tom was stable. They were doing CT scan. It looked like a stroke, but he was conscious, and the paralysis might be temporary. Too early to tell. Doctor will know more in a few hours. Why don't you come out to Albion and we'll keep you posted? Then Martha made another call. To Jim Kovac, the neighbor who'd relayed Tom's emergency. Jim, can you come over here to the South 40? I need to talk to you about something. What happened over the next 6 hours has been described to me by 3 different people who were there, and I've cross-referenced their accounts with what Martha herself told an Omaha World Herald reporter who did a story about it a month later. It's a story that's been repeated in different forms across the Great Plains for more than a century, but in 1998, it was becoming rarer, because the economics of farming had changed in ways that made the old traditions harder to maintain. Martha's proposal was simple. She needed people to harvest Tom's wheat, not custom cutters. They were booked solid, and besides, she didn't have cash to pay them up front. She needed neighbors. People with their own combines, their own trucks, their own fuel and labor, who would be willing to take time away from their own harvest to cut someone else's crop. In the old days, and by old days I mean up to the 70s, maybe even early 80s, this wouldn't have been an unusual request. Farm communities operated on a basis of mutual aid that was part economics, part culture, part necessity. Your barn burned down, the community showed up with hammers and lumber. Your husband got hurt, During harvest, neighbors brought their equipment. You paid them back in kind, or in labor, or just in the understanding that when you needed help, help would come. It was a system that worked when farms were smaller, more numerous, more tightly networked in genuinely local communities. But by 1998, that system was fraying. According to USDA's Census of Agriculture data, Wheeler County had lost 32% of its farms between 1982 and 1997. The farms that remained were bigger, more specialized, more leveraged, operating on thinner margins with more sophisticated equipment, and less slack in their labor and time. The old farmer who'd help you, because that's what neighbors did, was increasingly replaced by an operation running 5,000 acres with GPS guidance systems and harvest schedules planned down to the hour. Time was money in a much more literal sense than it had been for previous generations. So when Martha asked Jim Kovac if he could help, she wasn't just asking for a favor. She was asking him to make a business decision that could cost him real money, in lost time on his own farm, in equipment wherein fuel, and the opportunity cost of not being where he needed to be when he needed to be there. Jim thought about it for maybe 30 seconds. Then he said, "I can give you tomorrow. Got my own wheat about half done, but it can wait a day. I'll bring my combine over at first light." Then he made a call to his brother-in-law, who called another neighbor, who called someone else. And by 7 o'clock that night, when Martha finally got to hospital in Albion and sat down next to Tom's bed, he was stable, paralysis already starting to improve slightly with clot-busting drugs they'd given him, prognosis uncertain but not hopeless. She had commitments from 7 different farmers to bring combines to their South 40 starting at dawn. 7 combines. Now, let me tell you what that actually meant, because this is where the technical and economic realities get interesting. A combine by 1998 standards was not a simple piece of equipment. Even Tom's relatively modest 9,500 represented decades of engineering evolution from the pull-type harvesters of the 40s and 50s. These were self-propelled machines with hydrostatic transmissions, variable speed cylinder systems, diagnostic computers monitoring everything from engine temperature to grain loss out the back, air-conditioned cabs with more instrumentation than a car. They were also expensive to operate. Fuel consumption on a machine like the 9,500 ran about 8 gallons per hour of actual separator time. And in 1998, diesel was running anywhere from 90 cents to $1.10 per gallon, depending on where you bought it. So you were looking at $8 to $9 an hour just in fuel, plus wear on belts, bearings, chains, concaves, sieves, components that cost hundreds or thousands of dollars to replace. Custom cutters in Nebraska in 1998 were charging anywhere from $15 to $25 an acre to harvest wheat, depending on yield and conditions. For 1,800 acres, that would have been $27,000 to $45,000. Money Martha didn't have and couldn't get, not with Tom in a hospital and the bank already nervous about their loan position. The 7 neighbors who showed up at 5:30 the next morning represented something different. A mix of equipment generations and operator experience that tells you everything about where Great Plains agriculture was in the late 90s. Jim Kovac came with a John Deere 9600, one size class up from Tom's machine, newer by 3 years, 260 horsepower, could push a 25-foot header. He bought it new in 1996, just before grain prices collapsed, and was now locked into payments he couldn't quite afford but couldn't walk away from either. Dennis Paulson brought a Case IH1680 axial flow, a machine that represented a fundamentally different combined design philosophy. Instead of conventional cylinder and straw walkers, the Case used a longitudinal rotor that processed grain to machine in a spinning motion. Introduced in 1977, the 1680 was still competitive in 1998, though Dennis's machine was from 1989 and showing its age. It was smaller than the Deere's, 180 horsepower, smaller grain tank, but in the right hands it was still a productive machine. 3 brothers, the Adamson boys, as everyone called them though the youngest was 43, showed up together with 2 John Deere 7720s and 1 ancient 6620. The 7720s were from the mid-'80s, conventional machines that had been the standard before the rotary designs really took hold. The 6620 was even older, from 1979, a machine that should have been retired years ago but was still running because that's what you did when you couldn't afford new equipment. It had mechanical controls where the newer machines had hydraulic. No cab computer, manual adjustments for everything. The youngest Adamson brother, Carl, could run that 6,620 as fast as anyone could run a modern machine because he'd been running it since he was 16 and knew every quirk, every sound, every limitation. Hal Sorensen brought a massive John Deere 9610, the next evolution after the 9500, introduced in 1996. His was a 1997 model, which meant he'd bought it right at the peak of equipment prices and was now underwater on the loan. The 9610 put out 275 horsepower, could handle a 30-foot header, held 230 bushels in the tank. It was a serious machine, the kind of combine that said you were running 3 for 1,000 acres and doing it profitably, or at least you had been before grain prices collapsed. And finally, Walt Morrison showed up with something that surprised everyone. A Massey Ferguson 8570, a Canadian-built rotary machine that you didn't see many of in Nebraska. Walt was running only about 1,000 acres and probably could have skipped his own harvest for a day without major consequences. But he showed up anyway because that's the kind of man he was, and because his wife had been in the hospital the previous winter with pneumonia, and Tom Hendricks had shown up without being asked to feed Walt's cattle for 2 weeks straight. Never said a word about it. Never expected anything in return. 7 combines, 7 different machines representing maybe $1 million worth of equipment. 7 men who all had their own farms and their own pressures and their own problems, lined up in Tom Hendricks South 40, just as the sun broke over the horizon on September 19, 1998. Martha drove out from the hospital. She'd stayed with Tom all night, then driven home at 4 a.m. to shower and change and make coffee. Told Tom she'd be back by afternoon, and when she pulled up the field, she found 7 combines sitting in a row along the field edge and 7 farmers standing around Jim Kovac's pickup truck, working out logistics. Because this wasn't as simple as just turning 7 combines loose in the field. You can't do that. You'll have machines running into each other. Overlapping passes, gaps that get missed, grain trampled under by equipment making inefficient patterns. Harvesting 1,800 acres with multiple machines requires coordination, communication, planning. Jim laid out what became known later as the Hendricks Formation, though nobody called it that at the time. They'd run a modified echelon pattern. 3 combines would start on the north end working south, offset, so they weren't eating each other's dust. 3 more would start on the south end working north. Tom's own 9500, which Martha had gotten running again the previous afternoon, would work the west edge, cutting a border around the field to give the other machines room to turn at the ends without traveling over standing wheat. They'd communicate by CB radio, call out when they needed to unload, coordinate with the 2 grain trucks, Jim's and Hal's, that would shuttle wheat to the elevator in Bartlett. They'd work until they ran out of daylight, or ran out of wheat, whichever came first. It took them 11 hours. I want you to understand what that means. 7 combines, each one capable of harvesting 15 to 20 acres per hour in good conditions, working in coordination, managed to cut 1,800 acres of wheat in a single day. By themselves, it would have taken Tom's 9,500 about 5 to 6 days of dawn-to-dark work to cover the same ground. The difference between 5 days and 1 day in September in Nebraska with rain coming could easily be the difference between getting a crop and losing it. But it wasn't simple. Problems came up the way they always do when you're running equipment hard. Dennis Paulson's Case IH threw a belt 2 hours in, shut down the rotor. Would have been a disaster except Carl Adamson had a spare bell for his old 6620 that was close enough in size to work as a field repair. They got Dennis running again in 40 minutes. Hal Sorensen's big 9610 started losing power around noon. Turned out to be a fuel filter that got contaminated. Easy fix if you had the tools and the knowledge, which Hal did because when you're running a $250,000 combine, you learn to fix problems fast, or you go broke paying mechanics. Walt Morrison's Massey Ferguson started throwing grain out the back. That's grain loss. Kernels making it through the threshing and separation process without getting captured in the grain tank, just blown out onto the ground where it's wasted. On a modern combine, you can monitor grain loss with sensors, but you also learn to read it by eye, watching the stream of chaff and straw coming off the spreader. Walt caught it, adjusted his rotor speed and concave clearance, got it dialed back in. But for about 40 minutes there, He was leaving maybe 2% of the grain on the ground, which across 20 acres of his pass through the field added up to real money lost. They broke for lunch at noon. Martha brought sandwiches and coffee out to the field because nobody wanted to stop long enough to drive back to town. And Jim Kovac did some calculations on a piece of notebook paper, trying to figure out if they were going to make it. Weather was holding so far. Clouds building in the west, but no rain yet. If they kept this pace, if nothing major broke down, they'd finish by dark. Maybe. Around 3 in the afternoon, a reporter and photographer from the Albion News showed up. Someone had called the paper, probably one of the farmers' wives, and the editor had sent them out because this was exactly the kind of story small-town papers live for. Community comes together to help stricken farmer. The photographer got pictures of all 7 combines working together. This aerial view of machines cutting through golden wheat, dust rising, grain flowing. It was a beautiful image. It made the front page the next week, got picked up by the World Herald in Omaha, even made it into a farm magazine article about rural community traditions. What the pictures didn't show was the cost. Not the obvious cost, fuel, equipment, wear, time, but the opportunity costs and the risks that 7 men were taking by being there instead of somewhere else. Jim Kovac's own wheat needed another 3 days of work, and the forecast of the following week showed a 40% chance of rain. By taking the day to help Tom, he was pushing his own harvest into a weather window that might close on him. Hal Sorensen was running behind schedule on a cash rent farm he'd leased for the year. If he didn't get that farm harvested by the end of September, the landlord had the right to hire a custom cutter and charge Hal for it, per the lease agreement. Every hour Hal spent on Tom's farm was an hour he wasn't spending on that obligation. The Adamson brothers had put off maintenance on 2 of their combines to be here, maintenance that should have been done before harvest started, but they'd been short on cash and figured they could nurse the machines through 1 more season. Now they were running equipment that was increasingly likely to have a major breakdown, and if that happened on their own farm next week instead of Tom's farm today, they'd have no one to call for help because everyone else would be busy with their own harvest. These were the real costs of rural mutual aid in 1998. Not the sentimental story about neighbors helping neighbors, but the hard economic calculus of men deciding that some obligations transcended simple profit and loss calculations, even when they couldn't really afford for them to. By 7 p.m., as the sun was dropping toward the horizon and the light was turning that particular golden color that only happens in September, the last combine finished its last pass. Tom Hendricks' South 40 was cut. 1,800 acres, done. The grain was in the trucks, headed for or already at the elevator. The field was stubble now, golden straw lying in neat rows behind where the combines had passed, already being worked by the first flocks of blackbirds and starlings that always showed up after harvest to glean whatever grain had been missed. The 7 men shut down their machines, climbed down from the cabs, stood around in the cooling evening air, didn't say much. That's something outsiders sometimes miss about farming communities. The lack of speech at moments like this. Nobody made speeches. Nobody talked about what it meant or why they'd done it. Jim Kovac just shook Martha's hand, said, "Give Tom our best," fired up his 9,600, and headed back to his own farm where his own wheat was waiting. The others followed, one by one. Combines rumbling down county roads in the gathering dark, heading back to their own operations and their own pressures. Martha stood in the empty field and cried for about 10 minutes, then got in her truck and drove back to Albion to sit with her husband. Tom Hendricks spent 4 days in the hospital and another 2 weeks in outpatient rehabilitation. The stroke had been moderate. He'd lost function on his left side, but most of it came back with therapy, though his left hand never quite worked right again. The neurologist told him he'd been lucky that the clot-busting drugs had worked, that he'd gotten help fast enough to prevent permanent major damage. Tom knew he'd been lucky in more ways than one. The wheat brought $2.48 a bushel at the elevator in Bartlett. After accounting for the 180 bushels Tom had dumped on the ground during his stroke, they got 71,820 bushels off the 1,800 acres. About $178,000 gross. Out of that came trucking costs, elevator charges, the final payment on the combine loan, and every other expense that accumulates when you're running a farm. After everything was said and done, Tom and Martha cleared about $41,000 on that wheat crop. In a good year, they'd have made twice that. But 1998 wasn't a good year. For most farmers in Nebraska, 1998 was barely a break-even year. For some, it was a year they quit. Tom tried to pay his neighbors back. He called each of them, offered to work on their farms, to pay them something for fuel and time, to do anything that would settle the debt he felt he owed. Every single one of them refused payment. "You'd have done the same for me," Jim Kovac told him. And Tom realized that was true. He would have, not because he could afford it, but because that's how it worked, or how it used to work. Here's what happened over the next 2 years, because this story doesn't have a purely happy ending. Endings rarely are in farming. Jim Kovac got his own wheat harvested 4 days after helping Tom, just before a 3-day rainstorm rolled through Wheeler County. The rain knocked down about 30% of his crop. Not enough to destroy it, but enough to reduce his yield significantly and create enough quality issues that the elevator docked him hard on test weight. He barely broke even that year. In 1999, he sold his farm to a corporate operation out of Grand Island and went to work for them as an equipment operator. He's still farming the same land he owned, technically, but now he does it for a salary instead of equity. Hal Sorensen got caught in a cash crunch in 2000 when grain prices stayed low and his equipment loans came due at the same time. He ended up selling his big 9610 at auction for half what he owed on it, had to restructure his entire operation, dropped from 4,000 acres to about 1,500. He's still farming, but he's doing it on a much smaller scale, and he'll probably never recover the equity position he had in 1998. 2 of the Adamson brothers quit farming entirely between 1999 and 2001, sold out to their oldest brother, who now runs the whole operation by himself with hired help during harvest. The old 6,620 finally died in 2003. Threw a rod to the engine block in the middle of the field, wasn't worth fixing. Carl Adamson, the youngest brother who could run that machine better than anyone, is now working as a mechanic in Grand Island. He says he doesn't miss farming. His wife says he's lying. These aren't failures. Exactly. They're just the realities of late 90s and early 2000s agriculture. According to USDA data, between 1997 and 2002, more than 55,000 farms went out of business across the United States. Family farms, most of them operations that have been in the same family for 2, 3, sometimes 4 generations. They weren't bad farmers. They weren't lazy or stupid or incompetent. They were caught in an economic squeeze between low commodity prices and high input costs, operating on margins so thin that one bad year could wipe out 5 good years of accumulated equity. And there was no way to plan for the bad years because you couldn't predict when grain prices would collapse or when a drought would hit or when your spouse would get cancer and the medical bills would eat up everything you'd saved. The 7 neighbors who showed up to help Tom Hendricks in September 1998 were operating in an agriculture economy that was fundamentally different from the one their fathers and grandfathers had known. The old traditions of mutual aid and community support were still there, still valuable, still part of what made rural life meaningful. But they were existing alongside, sometimes in conflict with, economic pressures that made those traditions harder to sustain. Modern farmers facing similar situations today have some advantages their 1998 counterparts didn't have. Better crop insurance programs. For one thing, the federal crop insurance system has been significantly expanded and improved since the late 90s. More sophisticated financial planning tools. Better access to capital in some cases. But they also face disadvantages. Higher equipment costs, more complex technology that's harder to repair yourself, larger scale operations that leave less room for the kind of informal neighbor-to-neighbor cooperation that Tom Hendricks relied on. The question of whether what happened in Tom's field in September 1998 could happen today is complicated. Would 7 neighbors still show up with combines to help someone in crisis? In some communities, absolutely. In others, maybe not. Not because people are less generous or less community-minded, but because the economics of modern farming make it harder to take that kind of time away from your own operation. When you're running 8,000 acres with GPS-guided equipment and precision agriculture techniques, planned down to the hour with harvest, weather models, and market timing strategies, the slack that allows for spontaneous community aid is harder to find. But maybe that's exactly why stories like this matter, because they remind us what's possible when people decide that some things are more important than profit margins. Tom Hendrick's wheat crop got harvested because 7 men made a decision that, strictly speaking, wasn't economically rational. They spent their time, their fuel, their equipment took risks with their own operations to help someone who couldn't pay them back. They did it because it was the right thing to do, because that's what neighbors do. Because 30 years earlier, or 40 or 50, their fathers and grandfathers had done the same thing, and someone had done it for them. And that tradition still meant something even in an agricultural economy that was making it increasingly expensive to maintain those traditions. Tom Hendricks is 73 years old now as of 2024. He's retired from active farming. His son took over the operation in 2008, runs it with modern equipment and precision techniques that Tom barely understands. The farm is still there, still in the family. That's rarer than you might think, given what happened to family farming over the last 25 years. Tom still lives in a farmhouse where he raised his kids, still watches the wheat grow every summer, still pays attention to harvest timing and grain prices, even though he's not the one making the decisions anymore. And every September, when combines start rolling to fields around Bartlett, he thinks about that day in 1998 when 7 neighbors showed up at dawn with their machines and cut 1,800 acres in a single day because he'd had a stroke and couldn't do it himself. He thinks about Jim Kovac, who took time away from his own harvest to organize the whole thing. About Dennis Paulson's case IH throwing a belt in Carl Adamson, having the right replacement in his truck. About Hal Sorensen's big 9,610 cutting 30-foot swaths through golden wheat. About Martha standing in the field that evening after everyone had gone home, cry because she couldn't believe people would do that for them. And he thinks about how much it cost those 7 men to be there, not just in fuel and equipment wear and lost time, but in the risks they took with their own operations, and the hard economic choices they made to prioritize someone else's crisis over their own pressures. Because that's the part of the story that doesn't make it into newspaper articles or feel-good reports about rural communities. The real cost of rural mutual aid in an era when farming had already become a business where margins didn't allow for generosity. If you lived through the late 90s as a farmer, I want to hear from you in the comments. What were grain prices like in your area? Did you see this kind of neighbor cooperation, or was it already fading by then? How did your community handle it when someone got hurt or sick during a critical time? Because these stories matter. They're part of agricultural history that's disappearing. Not because the events didn't happen, but because the people who lived through them are getting older, and once they're gone, we lose the details that make these stories real, instead of just sentimental legends about the good old days. I spend weeks researching each of these stories, going through agricultural reports, economic data, equipment specifications, interviewing people who were there. Because this history matters. This is how American agriculture changed from a system based partly on community cooperation to a system based almost entirely on individual operations optimizing for efficiency and profit. Both systems have value. Both systems produce food and supported families. But something was lost in the transition, and it's worth understanding what that something was, and what it cost, and whether there's any way to preserve the best parts of the old system while still operating in the economic realities of a new one. If this story resonated with you, if you've got your own experiences with farm communities helping each other out or failing to do so, or if you just want to talk about what farming was like in your area during this era, drop a comment. And if you want more stories like this, deep dives into agricultural history that actually look at the economic and technical realities instead of just the feel-good headlines, hit that subscribe button. Because there are hundreds of stories like Tom Hendricks out there, and they deserve to be told accurately, with all the complexity and cost and hard choices that made them real. Tom Hendricks got his wheat harvested because 7 neighbors showed up, but those 7 neighbors paid a price for showing up, and some of them are still paying it. That's the real story of rural mutual aid in late 20th century America. Not that it didn't exist, that it existed in spite of everything working against it. And that's worth remembering.